I'm reminded of a very familiar, definition, you might even say, of modern art and contemporary modern practices, the contemporary world we work in as artists, and that is that our business is to represent the unrepresentable. Given that, I just wonder if you could say a few words about the work that we have here in the studio behind you. I understand it's the reception series. I'm interested by somebody else who has characterized your work as exploring the essence of form, consistently evoking shapes that lie beyond the world of objects. And would you like to say just a few words about this piece?
Mm-hmm. Well, again, there are many layers. The first concern for me was to look at work that had not been received in a way that we assume is usually the case, but that process was lying outside those patterns. And I've chosen a number of figures who for me represented that unusual development in the way audiences have responded to the work. So in this case of the work we have behind us, it is Robert Walser. And Robert Walser was a Swiss writer who died in 1956, whose work was highly acknowledged earlier in his career. He wrote novels, short texts and so on, which were published in book form or in newspapers. Clearly received. The work was known by major literary figures and so on. And at one point he was institutionalized for health reasons. And he continued to write, but the writing was in a tiny, tiny script, millimeter large or big only, as a process of writing. He did this as a daily activity and wrote on scraps of paper and so on. Nobody knew whether there was content or whether he was in essence going through the process of writing without developing content. It was unknown. And at his death, his guardian tried to preserve the work. He wanted it to be destroyed, and luckily it didn't happen. And many years later, it took two literary historians 18 years to decipher those texts, and they could establish that in fact there was content to those brief texts. And I was very interested in that circumstance, that it was not clear what his thinking was at the time in terms of what would happen to the work. And clearly he did not need an audience. In his mind, the writing process as a very private activity was more relevant. In fact, he was a bit of a recluse, hence the text at the bottom, how dare you talk to me as if you knew me, which again resonated with me. This is a direct quote. And I became very interested in the whole idea of the microscripts. They're very beautiful. And ironically enough, of course, I enlarged the microscript to this size, which is, very different, of course, from seeing the originals. And I'm calling this work in terms, of not the cycle, but the subtitle to this particular work within the reception theory overall umbrella construct, translating the illegible. So the idea that something was not only illegible but only partially visible, that those two things came together, was very, very interesting to me. And as we just discussed with the Untitled series, there are elements also which bring forms to the threshold of the perceptible, in this case also legible, which for me allows a viewer to be much more intensely engaged in trying to decipher, of course, literally and metaphorically, the meaning of those works. So it is something that runs through quite a few of my works. In fact, I'm working on a large series now where I have erased a lot of the works on paper. So the idea again of removing them from the viewer enough that the elements of doubt, which for me philosophically is a very important construct, the question of veracity, truth, and so on, come into the discussion, into the debate. So those are some of the reasons why I felt this may be a way to frame the questions so that those issues would come up for a viewer.
All of this, of course, if I draw back a bit, Therese, raises another question. It's a very large question. I'm not really sure if there's any real good answer to it, but we work, as artists, we work in a larger context, context of ideas, particularly ideas as they're being understood at the moment, in the moment. And there is the sort of haunting question, what is the context in which one is operating at a given moment as an artist? And I wonder if you have any thoughts about this given moment, the moment that we're working in here in the second decade of the 21st century, what kind of context we work within. In a sense, a context is also a boundary, a set of suggestions or a series of references to which we need to respond. And just as the artists of the 60s responded to certain ideas then, do you think that there's a particularity to the context in which we operate today as artists?
I think every moment has its own framework, and one that we may recognize quite readily, or one that we have difficulty identifying. And sometimes it's both, that certain things come into focus quite clearly, we can realize them and respond, acknowledge them, either by confirming, supporting, or in a critical way. Either art holds up that, what I called a model previously, that puts us in a position of having to respond, as I said, either in an affirmative or in a critical way. Of course, one of the things that has shaped the 21st century beyond our wildest expectations are the new technologies. And we cannot escape the reality that that affects our everyday life at every turn. And I think as artists, of course, we struggle with the intentions or desire to make sense out of this all. So I think it is one aspect of today's reality that is ever present, and I think every generation will find different ways of relating to it. We see it in a slightly larger time frame than, let's say, the younger generation that can inhabit that more easily. We always, have the questions attached to what it might mean, I think, with the perspective gained over time. That constructing meaning and trying to find out what that means is fraught with not only fears and apprehension, but also, of course, with new insights, fundamental insights. Also, of course, how we perceive the world has changed dramatically. We have, now learned so much about how in scientific research the universe is perceived as an entity that's far larger than we could have imagined. So even the position of the world in relationship to the larger entity has shifted dramatically. I think it shapes the perception of who we are now and what the meaning is of that. So I would say, those two things, our awareness of the reality of the world in the largest possible context and the new technologies would be two things I would see as shaping our perceptions fundamentally.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Interesting. I'm interested how aware you are of other voices in the world, if you can put it that way. And turning that around, Therese, is there a particular way in which you hope or expect a larger audience to relate to your own work? Do you have any expectation about that, or anticipation?
Well, I think this is a very difficult question because it can mean so many different things. And I think the way art is being received, it brings us back to the whole issue of reception, yet again, has been changing so dramatically. So clearly the expectation I had when I was a younger artist was different from what it was 10 years later, 20 years later, and now I feel I know less than ever what that may mean. Because of course, with the new media, the dissemination of images, all the parameters that we have gotten used to have been removed. So I find it's extremely complex to think about that, and of course, we have two options. One is to try and control to some extent how we would like that process to take shape. And on the other hand, to think we absolutely cannot control it. So the only options we have is to let it happen, And of course, where we present the work is primary, what do we choose as a strategy to either, address the largest possible audience or to address a very narrow audience that's highly knowledgeable and clearly defined, and then many, many shades in between. And of course, I make a huge distinction between the public and an audience. When I think of an audience, I think of a group of individuals who are already interested in the activity in principle, and an audience that may be specialized or highly specialized is possible. But if we think of the internet, of course, there are no boundaries whatsoever. It can mean anything, and yet we can also, through the internet, try to address a specific audience. Now the expectation is for everyone to have a website. It's like a role a gallery used to play in some ways, So I think the options have changed completely, and I think we are all trying to find ways that suits our previous history, so there's a sense of continuation and consistency and integrity, or we just let go and allow things to happen and chance to play a much larger role. I have never felt that I wanted the largest possible audience. It was never my goal. The opposite. I have tended to perhaps withdraw a bit and address myself to a known circle within a community, and of course a community in turn can be defined as a small, we can think of Toronto, let's say, or we can think of Canada in a national context or an international context or globally. All of these things exist. They can overlap, of course. I think it's a very difficult question.
What about the role of the critic? I'm kind of curious. The question of criticism comes up time and again, of course, historically as well as currently, but particularly in this moment, there seems to be a question around the role of the critic and what critical reception actually constitutes. In your own experience, Therese, have you formulated any thoughts over the years about the nature of critical response and the kind of criticism that seems to be most effective?
Again, I think it is connected to the whole process of reception of artworks. The critic, of course, has a particular role. The critic is not the larger audience. The critic is an informed individual. We expect a highly informed individual who looks at work probably already with an extensive history of looking at works, perhaps looking at similar work, looking at radically different works. And of course, looking at works again at the certain moment in time. And I think there are many forms of criticism, each of which can be valuable for a certain circumstance. Of course, it can be an art historical lens that guides the analysis of a work, which is highly valuable. Or it can be a criticism from a particular theoretical position or ideological position, from a cultural context, and so on. And in each case, it can mean something different. I think what is crucial, most relevant in my mind, is the complexity of thinking. If the work even is highly critical, but it is written and approached with a high level of complexity, it can be extremely valuable. And the other component I see as relevant, and I see that as parallel to art production, that good work has to have a level of honesty. It cannot be strategic or propaganda or serve a propaganda agenda, but it has to be honest from the perspective of what that individual who writes knows and represents in relationship to that position. And I think, to me, it's absolutely parallel to making artwork. If an artwork is strictly strategic, for me it doesn't have a real value. And I think in criticism it's similar. And of course it can mean that it represents a particular ideological or theoretical or art historical position, but it has to come from a perspective of conviction and commitment, an honest commitment to those ideas, and a willingness to question some of those ideas at the same time also, not to become dogmatic or that a position is overly fixed. That I find problematic. So there has to be a personal questioning and a questioning of the work in the writing. You know.
I think I'll turn to the notion of the collector. Just thinking of what you were saying about this question of the personal and the honest in connection with criticism and in connection with art as well. Would you see the collector through that lens as well? What would be your notion of the admirable collector, let's say, Therese?
Well, I think collecting is an activity that's close also to the reception of artworks. We keep coming back to that topic. It is everything that happens between the production of the work and how it enters the larger world. Anything that is part of that process. And of course, collecting is another one. I think an excellent collector is somebody who has established criteria over a period of time. I think it takes time to formulate criteria based on which he or she develops a collection. It is somebody who can recognize in artists' work some of the concerns, some of the ideas a society is dealing with, and he feels an artist can articulate and discuss these ideas, and by bringing these works together into a specific relationship, a collector really participates in a discourse. I think the best collections have a responsibility to an audience, to a public. And of course, an individual can have a collection that's more idiosyncratic than, let's say, a collection established by an institution, a museum, where there is usually a group of people who make a decision together, which may to some extent also represent the ideas, goals, and aspirations of that institution. An individual is freed from those constraints and can take greater risks, perhaps, could also be more impulsive, very likely, could change course more easily. And I think a good collection is alive. It has a certain level of urgency. I think if it isn't alive and doesn't participate in a dialogue, it loses its meaning. So I think that's ultimately its greatest danger, to lose that clarity, that intensity. And again, of course, criteria are established according to all kinds of guidelines, but they are what guides the collection, and they emerge slowly. I think it takes time. And I think there are many different forms of collecting, but to me, this is what an ideal collector would do: have a true commitment to the work, and very likely be engaged in a dialogue with participants in an art community of different forms, maybe, you know, with curators, obviously with artists, with writers, with, and so on, a range of figures.
One last question. Circulating around a practice, and I think for a collector such as you're describing, something that would resonate, I think, with a collector especially, but with curators and, of course, the extended world of critics and such, circling around this process, let's call it, there is this haunting question: how can I understand what is real? How can I understand what is, you might say, authentic in the circumstance that I'm examining? Whether it's the artist looking at their own practice and pushing it forward, whether it's a critic or a curator or a collector attempting to assemble their relationship to the artist. Do you have any thoughts about what would constitute this notion, this very vague notion of authenticity or what is real? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think criteria of any form are established through comparison. And being able to look at intensive looking at many examples of certain types of work, and by comparing, I mean, once certain criteria are established, finding the best examples and then trying to look at those very carefully. And it would have to seem that those examples are distinct and are better able to articulate certain ideas than others. So I think it's, again, the precision by which ideas are articulated, the clarity, the precision, the thoughtfulness, the uniqueness, and of course, when I bring into the whole discussion the notion of honesty, it would be that honesty that makes the work distinct, that in that no other individual could be thinking exactly the same thoughts. That's when we think, of course, of a copy, that it is echoing something that is already established. So it would again bring into the discourse something that has previously been unknown, but has been developed with a knowledge that recognizes things which perhaps were precursors, relatives in terms of the constructs, or nuanced rearticulation. So it brings us back to what we talked about earlier, that the process of making art is combining what is known and what is unknown. If it is completely known, it becomes a copy, because everything has already been established. And the unknown element within something that's known with great depth and complexity makes for a unique, new articulation, you know.